leg of our year's journey together through the history of Western philosophy. Namely, 4 weeks dealing with about 200 years of empiricism, 19th and 20th century empiricism. And just to get the perspective, let's come back to this diagram, which you're familiar with, the intersection of modern empiricism and rationalism of the Enlightenment in the kind of synthesis effected by Immanuel Kant, out of which grew a distinction between two methodologies that have persisted in philosophy to this day. The rationalism of the Enlightenment was mainly on the European continent. Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz. And the outgrowth of that, as we've seen in Hegel, the existential tradition, to some extent people like Whitehead, but the outcome a phenomenological kind of method that tries to look at reality through the lens of the human self-awareness. Now, that phenomenological method continues today, as we were seeing last week, to dominate European thought, Western European thought on the continent. On the other hand, the empiricist tradition, Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, is mainly in Britain, and continued in the 19th century with the three people we're going to be looking at, Auguste Comte, John Stuart Mill, and Ernst Mach. And the greatest of these is Ernst Mach. No, take it back. The greatest of these is John Stuart Mill. Sorry, the last of them, Ernst Mach. John Stuart Mill is the one to emphasize. But that continuing empiricist approach led to an emphasis on scientific method being universalized for all kinds of human knowledge. Now, whereas then the way of seeing the world, the lens through which everything was seen for the European tradition, is the human spirit with its creative freedom. And I think that's a fair generalization, whether you're talking of Hegel or of Sartre or of Dewey, you see. On the other hand, the lens through which the 19th century empiricists are seeing everything is simply the lens of nature as viewed through the scientific method. And so the ways part. Now, to this day, throughout the 20th century, it's fair to say that the dominance, the philosophical dominance in the continent of Europe is phenomenological, whereas the philosophical dominance in English-speaking philosophy is empiricist. And while perhaps not as imperialistic about scientific methodology as it was in Mill and the early 20th century, still a pretty strong theme that something like scientific criteria should be used in judging all human knowledge. So that's the distinction. There are attempts, obviously, to see comparisons between the two, to build bridges. I may have mentioned to you before that there was in the 1940s, the late 40s, a joint conference between English and French philosophers, the proceedings of which were published, and volume called La Philosophie Analytique, Analytic Philosophy. And as you try to read it, you find that while the Frenchmen write in English, which is of help to many of us, and the English write in French, they pass like ships in the night because they're just dealing with different things. Some 5 years ago, I was at a conference in Toronto where there were European philosophers, more Dutch than French, and Anglo-Americans dealing with the concept of rationality. Same experience, passing like ships in the night, you see. Simply because the methodology is different and the kinds of expectations are different. That's not to say that there are not some analytically oriented philosophers in European thought. There are, or that there are not some phenomenological thinkers in American thought, shall we say. There are. Most large departments try to have at least one representative, you know. We have one, Roberts, except that he has sort of wandered over into analytic thought, thanks to his work in Wittgenstein as well as his work in Kierkegaard and Bultmann. So the situation is there. Now, what I want to do today is to characterize 19th century empiricism, and we may have to continue with this on Monday, when we will be moving into 20th century. Next Monday, we'll be moving into early 20th century with people like Bertrand Russell, John Stuart Mill, George Ernest Moore, G.E. Moore. Okay. But for the characterization of 19th century, look at these three emphases. The extension of Enlightenment objectivity into, and I've written the hypothetico-deductive method, perhaps to make it a little more clear, into a hypothetico-deductive method. That is to say, a methodology applicable to science in the spirit of Enlightenment objectivity, rejecting the Kantian kind of Copernican revolution. Now, what do I mean by a hypothetico-deductive method? That phrase, you'll find it becomes increasingly familiar. But the previous Enlightenment thought in these 18th century empiricists had, of course, premises that are empirical generalizations, and from that, deductive inferences. And if we're talking about the continental rationalists, like Descartes, Spinoza, then what you have is some sort of intuitive, self-evident, innate, a priori premises and deductive method. In other words, the methodology of Enlightenment thought was from premises via deduction to logical conclusion, either a priori or empirical premises. Then 19 innate ideas and so forth are questionable. That empirical generalizations are awfully hard to verify. You can falsify them, but verifying them is empirically pretty difficult, and you've got the problem of induction. So instead of empirical generalizations or a priori premises, the emphasis is on a hypothesis as the premise. So from an empirical hypothesis, if this is true, what follows? Hypothetico-deductive. So a hypothesis for the premise leading to deductive methods. Now, this is much more in keeping with actual scientific method. Remember, one of the criticisms of Francis Bacon and his inductive methods was that he gave no room to the use of hypotheses. Experimental methods, but without hypotheses. Well, here you see is a more mature approach, 19th century, and the hypothetico-deductive method. This becomes the understanding of scientific method in John Stuart Mill, in Ernst Mach, in Bertrand Russell, in 20th century logical positivism. In fact, it really wasn't cracked until Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, when it was recognized that science works more with paradigms than with hypotheses. Okay? So keep that in mind. Now, the second characteristic, the extension of that method, the hypothetico-deductive, to the human sciences. Previously, the tendency had been to think simply of science as dealing with physics, astronomy. That's where it started. Chemistry came into the game. Biology gradually. But the significant thing in the 19th century is the extension of these kinds of methods to the human sciences, that is to say, to psychology, to sociology, to politics. The attempt also to apply it to ethics, so that ethics could become an empirical science. That's precisely what John Stuart Mill was after in his utilitarianism. He wanted to have an empirical scientific ethic. So the extension of that scientific method to the human knowledge, the natural sciences of the social sciences, this becomes known in some quarters as scientism. Scientism. That science and science alone yields reliable knowledge. Scientism. And of course, our continental friends, meantime, would have conniptions over this sort of thing. What about the human spirit? What about the phenomenological method, and so forth? In fact, you might think of Husserl's attempt to deal with what he called the crisis in the sciences in the light of this. He wants to make philosophy into a rigorous science, but not with a hypothetical method. You see, with a priori principles derived by the phenomenological method. So then, these things, but there's a consequence. And the consequence of this extension of scientific method to global range is the development of phenomenalism, anti-realism, anti-metaphysics. Yeah, phenomenalism, all we know is phenomena, things as they appear to us. What nowadays we call anti-realism. We don't know knowledge of ultimate reality as it is in itself. And the way it comes out, particularly in the 19th century, is a rejection of metaphysics. And I think that's particularly significant in the 19th century because the nature of metaphysics, you